Hello everyone, and thanks for coming to tonight's event. We've got Laura Smith talking about Eileen Agar. I'm Simon from Five Leaves, and I just need to do a little bit of housekeeping. Thanks to Harriet at Eiderdown Books for doing this series with us, and thanks to Lauren, who'll be signing for us tonight. If you have trouble seeing Lauren during the presentation, there should be a little tab in the middle of the screen, and just drag it to the left to enlarge them. And lastly, thanks to the Arts Council for making the events possible. Feel free to ask questions throughout the event, but could you just put them in the Q&A box along the bottom, because they tend to get lost in the chat box. But with all that done, I'll just hand over to Harriet and Laura. Thanks.
Thank you, Simon. Good evening to everyone, and welcome to the penultimate Night School talk, the fourth event in a series of 5 weekly online talks taking place throughout Women's History Month, celebrating some brilliant women artists. I'm Harriet Olsen, and I'm the founder of Eiderdown Books. I'm delighted that tonight we have with us Laura Smith to talk about the wonderful Eileen Agar, who is the subject of our most recent book in the Modern Women Artists series. It's book number 6, and we published it in February. So it was made during peak pandemic lockdown, and it feels like something of an achievement to now be holding it in my hands. I'm very grateful for the support of bookshops like Five Leaves, who are championing us as a new indie publisher, especially during these unprecedented times, and to everyone who has bought any of our books so far. We say about this series of books, this Modern Women Artists series, that they reveal an alternative history of art, telling the stories of important female artists whose art might otherwise be overlooked, overshadowed, or forgotten. And that read together, these books begin to redress the untold history of modern art. Actually, I think Agar is one of the better known artists we've included so far, and that recognition looks set to grow further as a major exhibition of her work, curated by our author Laura Smith, will open at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in London on the 19th of May this year. Prior to her role as curator at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, Laura was curator at Tate from 2012 to 18, where she was responsible for a series of international, historic and contemporary projects, including the important touring exhibition, Virginia Woolf, an exhibition inspired by her writings, which included around 80 female artists. One of the reasons I felt it was important to include Eileen Agar in this series was because when we read about her, we learn that she was one of the very few women artists to be included in the 1936 London International Surrealist Exhibition. So having her in this series points to the omission of other women from that exhibition, and who, by their omission, drop out of the narrative of art history, and their names get lost and their work forgotten. We could mention Lee Miller, Ethel Colquhoun, Edith Rimington, Valentine Hugo, Emmy Bridgewater, all important surrealists working at this time, none of whom were included in that seminal exhibition. We included Frances Hodgkins in our Modern Women Artists series, she's book 2, for a similar reason, because she was the only female artist to be included in a much earlier series of books, which celebrated individual modern artists, the Penguin Modern Painters series, published in the 1940s, which comprised 19 books with only one about a female artist, Frances Hodgkins. So by including some of these women in our series, we highlight the many women who have been overlooked. And as I said last week, there is much work to do to bring these artists out of obscurity and show their work as being equal to that of their male contemporaries, whose names we all already know. So even though Agar was included in that 1936 Surrealist exhibition, and she did have solo exhibitions in her lifetime, it's only really recently that we have started to see her included in the discourse around important 20th century artists. Interestingly, if you look at the Wikipedia entry for her, you'll see 90% of it talks about her work from the 20s and 30s, up until the Second World War, really. But she continued to work right up until her death in 1990. So there's a lot to get through in the next half an hour or so. So without further preamble from me, I'm going to pass the screen over to Laura to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the work of Eileen Agar. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you, Harriet. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's working for everyone. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Harriet. And yes, apologies, it's going to have to be whistle stop because Agar was one of the most prolific artists that I've come across in my career to date. She had a 70-year career that began in the 1920s and worked through until her death in 1991. She was born in 1899, a month before the new century, and she was so frustrated by this fact that for the first couple of years of her kind of prominence and career, she lied about her age and told people that she was born in 1901, not because she wanted to be younger, but because she wanted to be born in the century of modernism, as she called it. So she had a pioneering practice, and for me is one of the most important artists of the 20th century. She worked across all media without hierarchy. She worked in painting, photography, collage, assemblage, sculpture, and performance, as well as fashion design and graphic design, favouring no media over the other and giving painting no more prominence than she would collaging a chocolate bar wrapper on several pieces of paper, for example. And one of the things that I find so exciting about her is that she was working through a time of tremendous social change. She lived through 2 world wars, and there's an anecdote that I really enjoy that sort of illustrates the breadth of her awareness of the 20th century, that she was really good friends with Picasso, as I'll come on to talk about. But when she was eventually made a Royal Academician in 1990 and they asked her what music she wanted playing, she chose Oasis. And I find that really remarkable that this single woman had a close relationship with Picasso and also the pop band Oasis. But that's just a little anecdote. So her style, the style of her work, as Harriet said, was definitely surrealist, but she also worked with a very Cubist sensibility. And I think the uniqueness of her work across all the media that she used is that she was able to synthesize elements of both these 2 movements. She brought together elements of surrealism with elements of cubism and used them to complement one another. And she never wholeheartedly signed up to either movement. She found cubism to be a bit cold and rational and too intellectual. And surrealism, I think she embraced, and she particularly enjoyed the irrationality of it and the kind of the sex of it and the anxiety within it and working from the subconscious. But she was very suspicious about the idea of working from dreams or working completely from the unconscious. I think she didn't think that that was really possible. And she also had an issue with the way that the surrealists treated women artists, which I'll come on to talk about. But one of the most exciting things about her, and I think this quote says it all, and we open the book with this quote, is that she really charted her own path. And I don't know many artists with a career as long as hers that have stuck to their interests, their style, and maintained a curiosity and a sense of play for 70 years until she died. She was making paintings until the day she died, with the same sort of passion for it. And I think you can see that in her work. And it was also a way that she approached life. From everyone that I've spoken to who knew her, she met her friendships and her relationships and even her fashion choices and the way she dealt with her family, all quite unconventionally, but very wholeheartedly and with joy and love. So yeah, I think she's a quite remarkable artist. I'll give you a little bit of backstory about her life, and then I'll touch on some works, and then we'll have some questions with Harriet. So she was born, as I said, in 1899 in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And she was born into quite a wealthy, privileged family, although they were quite eccentric. And she describes her childhood in Argentina very surreally, as being full of St. Bernard dogs and hoops and balloons and plagues of locusts. Despite the kind of flamboyantness of her family, her mother was also a strict disciplinarian and was very frustrated by Agar's interest in art, which she had from an early age. So at the age of 6, in 1905, she was sent to boarding school in Dorset, England on her own. So she undertook the journey from Buenos Aires to London by boat, which is a long time, over 2 weeks, as a 6-year-old completely on her own, which is one of the things that I feel is quite remarkable about her. She attended a number of boarding schools throughout her childhood and her teenage years, and unbeknownst to her parents, at one of them, Heathfield in Ascot, she was taught by the painter Lucy Kemp Walsh, who told her to, quote, always have something to do with art. So as she grew older, her mother wanted her to become a debutante, to marry, to have children, and had started kind of introducing her to prospects. But she completely rebelled against this. And in 1924, she ran away to Cornwall and shaved her head as a kind of revolution, because then she couldn't become a debutante. And in the same year, she married a student who she had met at art school called Robin Bartlett, who her parents disapproved of because he was working class. She attended 2 art schools, Brook Green, which was led by Leon Underwood, the renowned engraver and printer, and after that, the Slade. And at both schools, she found the teaching quite conservative and very traditional. When she graduated from the Slade in 1925 became quite a watershed year for her. Her father died the same year, and though he was very disapproving of her life choices, he left her a small inheritance which would support her for a few years until she was able to make it as a professional artist. But at the same time, she, as I said, felt frustrated by the traditional conservative teachings of the Slade. And so she destroyed all of her work to date, which is why I haven't shown you any work yet, because there isn't any. So, I mean, she doesn't talk about it as a breakdown. She talks about it as a kind of a watershed moment, a life-changing year in which she really made the decision to pursue an artistic career that was outside of the conservative and traditional education and family life that she'd been experiencing. The following year, in 1926, she was at a party in London and she met the Hungarian writer Joseph Bard. And this, she says, was the most important moment of her life. Even though she was married to Robin Bartlett, she described meeting Joseph as the shock effect of putting everything into a new focus. And they began a relationship that lasted until he died in 1975 and was the most important relationship in her life. She divorced Bartlett the same year, and Joseph and her took flats next to each other with studios also next to each other in a building in West London, and they didn't actually marry until 1940, so they lived what was at the time quite a radical relationship. And from that moment on, she says she'd thrown off the shackles of her previous life, and she felt able to become a painter. And she painted this self-portrait in 1927 as a kind of representation of that newfound confidence and self-assurance. And I think when we look at it now, it doesn't seem like such a radical painting, but for 1927, I think even the length of her hair could be seen as controversial. The use of blue and green as a ground rather than white gives it, I think, a real freshness. And just the poise with which she's holding herself, I think we can really see, it's just almost like she's looking to her own future. The following year, she moved to Paris because, as I said, she was very frustrated by what she thought of as a very stuffy London art scene, and she wanted to experience the artistic revolution that was happening in Europe. So she moved to Paris, and while she was there, she was taught painting. She had painting lessons with a Czech cubist called Francis Steck-Foltin, as well as meeting Paul Eluard and André Breton, the surrealists. And I think those couple of years that she spent in Paris were foundational to the development of her entire style. So the sort of explorations into Cubism and Surrealism taken in tandem allowed her to pull out elements of each ism and merge them together to synthesize them to create a style that was very unique and very distinct. This is one of the first paintings that she made during that time, and she writes a lot about how she doesn't actually like it very much as a painting. It was originally titled The Flying Pillar, and then later was called The Three Symbols, but it's a kind of exploration of her response to what she called the patriarchy of art history or cultural history. So the three symbols represent the classics, classical architecture in the Greek column, that is the thing that's flying into the sky. In the background, you can see Notre Dame as a symbol of medieval Christianity. And in the bottom is a bridge by Gustave Eiffel of the Eiffel Tower, symboling the advent of modernity. And I think by employing these three symbols, and sort of pushing them literally out of the painting, she's really exploring what it might mean to destroy them or to dismantle them and to work outside of them. This is one of her most cubist works to date. This is Movement in Space from 1931, and this is one of the only cubist works that survives unaltered. So frustratingly, for me as a curator, she had a habit of working over completely finished and incredible paintings that she had kind of got bored of or hadn't seen for a few years and needed a canvas. So there are photographs of amazing similar Cubist style paintings from the 1930s, black and white photographs in an album she took of all her paintings that were then worked over in the 1960s or 70s when she wanted a canvas and was bored of the painting that was underneath it. But this one survives, and I think it really shows her experiments with Cubism, with the kind of flattening of form, the muted colour tones, the variations of texture, but also this burgeoning interest that she had in organic forms and natural forms with this shell-like structure in the middle. This work is a work that is thought of as an early masterpiece. And again, she she didn't give much importance to it. It was found by her biographer, Andrew Lambeth, who's been incredibly helpful when they were writing her biography in 1980s, the late 1980s. He found it rolled up in the eaves of her studio and unrolled it, and she apparently dismissed it and said it wasn't very good, and he told her it was, and the Tate bought it fairly quickly after it was found. So it's big, it's one of her biggest paintings, and really you can kind of see it as a code or as a cipher for the rest of her work to come. So within this work are many of the symbols and motifs that become really important to Agar for the rest of her career. So we can see the silhouette of a head in profile, we can see handprints, shells, fossils, leaves, foliage, birds, so many elements from the natural world, as well as classical figures, the 4 figures on the top, along the top, almost as kind of column markers. And the work is called Autobiography of an Embryo, and it's about or it's a kind of illustration of this theory that she was developing in the early 1930s called the theory of womb magic, where she talks about feminism or femininity being a form of creativity that would be beneficial to Europe. So she's really nervous, and rightly so, about the advent of war and the Spanish Civil War in particular, and the rise of fascism in Europe, and is thinking through the militancy of that and aligning it with certain masculine tropes, and thinking about ways of feminine creativity that she saw as having a more circular time, to being more constantly evolving rather than rejecting a past, but evolving from a past. And this theory of womb magic she published in a journal that she founded with her partner Joseph Bard called The Island, which ran for 4 issues in 1931. And then quite soon after, she painted this painting as an illustration of those ideas. And she talks about it as, rather than the 7 stages of man, a kind of cycle of human life, an evolution of human life. At the same time, she was exploring sculptural work, and the Surrealists in particular were very fond of using found objects, but particularly in Europe, those found objects were often man-made, ready-made, so things you might find in a flea market or a junk shop. And Agar was much more interested in natural found objects, in organic forms, and she began avidly beachcombing and forest walking and collecting stones and shells and bits and pieces that she found. And she said that she thought of this practice as sort of creative problem solving. She would use a shell or a starfish or the skull of a seagull, which is in the central image, to inspire or to sort of bring her out of the mundaneness of the everyday, to sort of shift her focus and inspire her to think differently. And these are some of the assemblages that she made during the 1930s and 40s, and they've very rarely been shown before. They're in the Tate archive, and we've managed to include some images of them in the book, as well as they'll be in the exhibition at Whitechapel Gallery, which opens soon. And they're really, when you see them in real life, they're really incredible, beautiful objects that have a sort of magical frisson or tension that as if nature has made them somehow. So around the same time, in 1935, she was visited by Roland Penrose and Herbert Reed, who were together with, his name's gone out of my head, I'm so sorry, it will come back to me. the poet David Gascoigne were curating the International Surrealism exhibition of 1936 in London, and they were doing studio visits to meet artists to potentially include. And as Harriet said, she was one of very few women included. I think the official tally is 6 women out of over 30 artists. And Agar found the whole thing quite amusing. She had as you can probably tell from what I've said so far, she had quite an irreverence to any form of authority, including her parents and her school and her education. And I think there's a lovely quote from her where she says, "One day I was making work that I thought was very personal and unique in style, and the next day they calmly informed me I was a surrealist." So she found the whole thing quite funny, but she allowed herself to be associated with the movement because it meant that she could exhibit in Europe and eventually internationally, because surrealism became such a high-profile movement that she ended up having, through the surrealists, having exhibitions across Europe and Japan and New York. This is one of the works that she included. She included 3 paintings and 5 objects. It's really tricky to find actual information about what those works were. Many of the works included by men were illustrated and photographed, but the works by women were not recorded. So we know she showed this, and we know she showed another painting called Winter, which is really beautiful, but I can't find any information about the objects that she showed. Similarly to Autobiography of an Embryo, this work has the 4 panels, so it's almost like a storyboard again. And the head is based on one of the horses of Selene, the moon goddess, from the Parthenon in the Acropolis in Athens. It's from a photograph she had of that statue. But she likens it more to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, because again, she's thinking about the rise of fascism in Europe, and so wanted to create these 4 horse silhouettes that kind of build with frenetic energy towards the end. So the first is much calmer than the last, which is much more dense and kind of anxiety ridden. The International Surrealism exhibition, in her words, attracted so much hullabaloo that she decided to leave London briefly. So in 1936, she and Joseph travelled to northern France, to Ploumanach in Brittany, and there she discovered these incredible rock formations and wanted to find a way to document them. She said this was the moment she said that she realised that nature was the greatest surrealist of all, that nature could create a sculpture. She said the ocean and the sun together create their own sculptures. And she wanted to find a way of documenting them, but found that she couldn't sketch them or paint them in a way that really did them justice. So the next day she travelled to the nearest town and bought a camera, her first camera, her first kind of professional camera, which would become her constant companion. And she bought a Rolleiflex 6x6, which is one of the square format cameras that sits on your chest. So I think that's why these rock photographs have such a bodily feeling. That they are not taken from head height, they're taken from the body, and they sort of they feel anthropomorphized. They feel like she's giving them a human quality. They're like her photographs are almost like portraits of the rocks. And there are over 50 of these. And the photographs became an enduring source of inspiration for the rest of her life, as we'll see a bit later. She sketched them and drew from them and collaged them for many years to come. Back in London, and very frustrated by the way that the women of surrealism were being treated, she started to make some works in response to that, though not overtly. She talks about the duplicitous nature of surrealism, in that sort of sexual freedom and lack of inhibitions was encouraged, but whenever the women engaged in these kinds of behaviors, it was frowned upon. And the women were more often than not talked about as muses first and artists second, or just as muses. So all of the women of Surrealism, I think, found this frustrating, and Agar wanted to use the way that Surrealism encourages us to think about imagined realities, to imagine a reality where she wasn't thought about as a muse first, or even the relationship of a muse wasn't a gendered one. So she made these casts of Joseph and took him for her muse. So the woman artist took a man for her muse. And she made them as plaster cast heads, but was really mortified when, not knowing really, I think, what she was going to do with them, but was completely mortified when they came back from the casting studio, and she said it was just Joseph's face in white and it looked like a death mask. So she very quickly began adorning them. Angel of Anarchy, that you can see with the feathers and the textiles, this is actually a second version of that sculpture. The first was, I think, a bit more similar to Angel of Mercy, the painted sculpture, but it was lost during a Surrealism exhibition in Amsterdam in 1937. So this is the second version, but I think she attacked them both, attacked is her word, with the same vigor to create these two companion works, both representative of Joseph, one being anarchic and one merciful. So this sort of his two roles to her, encouraging anarchy and encouraging mercy. And anarchy in particular is also a response to, again, the oncoming war. She said she wanted to blinker the sculpture to Europe's future. And they both have lots of really incredible details on when you see them up close. So Angel of Anarchy has these little diamante studs on Joseph's nose, which she stole from her mother's bed slippers without telling her. And Mercy has this really beautiful domino in its nose and this little sequined star on his chin. They feel very intimate and tender, and at the same time are really playing with sort of gender fluidity and this idea of the muse as a gendered notion. Similarly, the women of Surrealism were trying to take back their own image. So I guess we're probably all more aware of man-raised photographs of Lee Miller, who Harriet mentioned in the beginning, but a lot of them, the women of Surrealism, were photographed and painted by the men of Surrealism, and started to reappropriate those images to make their own self-portraits. So this is a photograph taken by Joseph, which she has then worked on top of with ink and gouache, and then she printed it large. It's over 3/4 of a meter tall, which I think is a very bold act. And when you think about this as a self-portrait in relation to the first one I showed you, which was less than 10 years previous, I think the development of her confidence and style is really evident. And then in the late 1930s, she began working with collage. Her first collages were made in 1934, we think. But in the late but the assemblages and the sculptural objects were made before she had experimented with collage. And then I think collage, with its more political foundations and its more sort of direct symbolism, became a medium that she was much more interested in the late 1930s. Again, because of her anxieties about the war, but also thinking about sort of some of those gender politics that I've mentioned. So again, this is Joseph, again taking Joseph for her muse. This is his profile cut out of a book of classical gemstones. Joseph was an avid collector of gemstones and precious stones, and And so again, it shows her irreverence to anything that might be thought of as authoritative. This is one of Joseph's books to identify his gemstones, and she just cut it up. And there are lots of things in her archive where she's got rare first editions of books or incredible prints of or posters of artists' works that she's just cut up to make collages out of. And the head in profile became a recurring motif, as we saw for the first time in Autobiography of an Embryo, and it reappears throughout her career. And she becomes much more interested in the natural world and in landscape and organic forms. And there's lots of feminist literature about thinking about the natural world and landscape as a way of imagining a different societal structure. So if culture and the urban environment is constructed under patriarchy, then the natural world and the landscape aren't, and perhaps they offer a way of imagining something else, a different reality. So this, I think that's one of the, or I'm reading that as one of the reasons why she's so interested in the natural world and the ocean. This is one of my favorite of her collages. This is Marine Collage in 1939, and I think we can see her anxiety building in her work, and this work is so much more dense and loaded than this work of 2 years previous. And again, she uses that same force structure storyboard style to show all these much more aggressive sea creatures, so leeches and lampreys and sea snakes, flowing through these women's minds. And this is one of her final pre-war paintings, Muse of Construction, 1939, and one of her biggest paintings. And this is actually a portrait of Picasso from a photograph that she took of him sitting on the beach smoking a cigarette, which is quite a well-known photograph, some people might have seen. And then she painted it, and it was originally supposed to be titled The Urn Goddess, because the central, his chest looks like an amphora. But she changed it, I think, almost to demonstrate her sort of the way she approached him. So she said that she was one of the only people who said that Picasso's influence was too strong, or one had to be wary of his influence, that you could get pulled into his orbit and never escape. So she's sort of calling him a muse of his own construction, while at the same time it's a tribute to him because it has so many Cubist tropes and so many sort of nods to Picasso's style in the painting. I'm aware that I need to hurry up. Sorry, I said it would be whistle stop. So when the war finally happened, she and Joseph, she volunteered in a canteen on Savile Row, and she managed to keep a studio in London, but felt she wasn't able to paint. She said, how can one communicate with any subtlety when Europe is deafened by the sound of bombs? So she turned to collage because of its directness, and some of the collages and paintings that she made during that time are much more dense and much more loaded. So these are both from 1942. And she had an exhibition of her collages at Redfern Gallery in 1942 and showed 24 new collages that were very similar to the last two I just shown, very heavy work. This is the work she made in 1945 at the end of the war, called Dance of Peace. And I think this is sort of a pull-out work from that year, because it sort of misleads us into thinking that she was feeling happier and able to paint. But for me, when I read it alongside the rest of her work from that time and her autobiography, she was exhausted by the war. They both were also volunteering as fire wardens. Their London home had become host to colleagues who were fleeing persecution in Europe, or colleagues who had had their homes destroyed by the Blitz. she hadn't been able to paint. She'd been working in this canteen 6 days a week, and I think she just felt despondent and uninspired. And this painting is the only one from that period that shows any kind of joy or sense of peace or the pastoral, almost like she's trying to persuade herself to be happy. The works from that period are much more like this. They're much heavier, denser, and she starts to bring back lots of surrealist techniques, such as decalcomania, which is when you put paint or ink between two sheets of paper and peel it apart. Frottage, rubbing, or automatic painting, which is pouring, and then working compositionally into those techniques. So she didn't feel any kind of ability to make joyous work, she said, until 1953, when she was invited to spend the winter in Tenerife with a friend. And I think the island of Tenerife, with its volcanic earth and tropical vegetation, really revived her. And she made a number of frottages there because she said she wanted to capture both the aridness of the volcanic desert and the botanical forms of the tropical vegetation. So there are lots of very beautiful, quite small frottages from her time in Tenerife. And then in her later career in the 60s, she moved into a much larger studio in West London, and she also discovered acrylic paint. And both of those things had a huge impact on her career. She was able to paint on a much bigger scale. So to date, most of her work had been, it's all around 50 centimeters, not much over a meter. But now she was able to paint over a meter, and she found acrylic to be a much more versatile medium than oil paint. She really enjoyed how she could layer translucencies of it, almost like building a collage into a painting, which we can see here and here. This is one of my favorite paintings of hers. It's based on the throne of Ludovisi in Rome, which depicts Aphrodite being lifted from the ocean by her two handmaidens. And I think the upward motion in it is really incredible, and her use of blue and the texture of the blue is really, really soft for her work of this time. Quickly to finish up, this is a work that she made in 1979 called Bride of the Sea. Joseph died in 1975, and she was completely heartbroken and felt unable to paint for some time. She started writing his biography, which eventually turned into her autobiography. And this is one of the first paintings that she made following his death. And I think it sort of recalls all of their beach walks together, their life traveling and finding objects on the shore, and her idea of him. She's essentially equating him with the ocean, which is one of the most important parts of her life. I'm not going to talk about that because we don't have time. And these are some of the last works that she made. So these are paintings based on the photographs that she took in Ploughmanach in 1936. And these were made in 1985, so almost 50 years later. And they're all 60 by 60 centimeters, so they're big, and there are almost 30 of them. And I think that they demonstrate her enduring joy, the enduring joy she found in the natural world, and her love of color, and the sort of surrealist influence that she brings to everything without ever being overtly surrealist. And that's it. I'll stop talking. Sorry for talking so long. And we'll open up to questions from Harriet and the audience.
Laura, thank you very much for that really interesting talk and whistle-stop tour. So yes, please do, if anyone, we've had a couple of questions in, but I'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to put your questions into the Q&A function if there's something you'd like to ask Laura. And just while we wait for that to happen, maybe Laura, I could just start by asking you, we spoke in my introduction, I was talking a little bit about the Surrealist exhibition and about those artists who weren't included. And I was thinking about your exhibition that you're curating at the Whitechapel, and really kind of how do you go about, you know, what do you include, what do you not include, and similarly, you know, with the book, it's a small book, so you had to be, you know, you had to make a decision about what do you include and what do you not. So I just wondered if you want to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been difficult because she made so much work. So I mean, if you think that she made nearly a work a day for 70 years, there's a lot. I mean, she worked over some things, as I said, but it was really important to me to include elements from all the media that she used. And I don't think there've been a couple of exhibitions since she died, and I don't think that they have ever included painting, collage, sculpture, assemblage, photography, and even performance. So this performance, I put a link to it in the chat earlier of her wearing one of her bonkers hat designs and walking along the King's Road. But her being so dexterous in her use of media, I think, is one of the things that's really incredible about her, and makes her feel really contemporary, that she didn't favor one medium over another. So I wanted to make sure that we did that in the book and the exhibition, and also to show work from the breadth of her life. So to show that she was still making these huge, really brightly colored rock paintings when she was 86, to some of her sketches that she was making, this beautiful series of sketches of Joseph from the 1920s when she first met him. And her, I think, demonstrating that breadth just shows her sensibility to line and color and form. And not only is she an incredible surrealist and cubist, but she's also a really amazing colorist and drafts person. Is that an answer?
Definitely. I'm just reading, suddenly we're getting a flurry of questions, so I'm gonna ignore the rest of my questions, which actually some of these cross over. So let me ask the ones from our audience tonight. So Nancy, actually there's a couple of questions I think about autobiography of an embryo. So Nancy asked whether that's on display at any of the Tate galleries, and then someone else has just asked, but it's in the chat function. Hang on, let me just scroll. Here it is. So they asked, do you know why Agar wasn't pleased with autobiography of an embryo? Does she have any other work related to the womb magic theory? And also, is the paper she wrote accessible or published at all? So that's like a couple of questions.
So it is usually on display at Tate Modern in the Surrealism room. It's going to be moving and coming to Whitechapel Gallery in May. So it will be on view in London. I don't know why I think she loved making work, and I think she believed in herself as an artist, but she didn't, almost like the way she approached media, she didn't think any work was great or better than another thing. And she would, even with her sculptures, she would quite often disassemble them and stick a bit onto another bit. So I think she just didn't, she was really anti this idea of genius. And so any work that now we might think of as a masterpiece, like Autobiography of an Embryo is talked about as an early masterpiece, I think she was just not of that mindset. She just wanted to keep being creative. So I don't know why she didn't think it was great when it obviously is. And it's so worked and labored, and there are so many details in it. She's obviously spent a lot of time on it. I don't know if it's to do with the subject matter, if she maybe stopped thinking so strongly about this idea of womb magic. She doesn't talk about it at all in her autobiography. So it's only from Andrew that I know that he found it rolled up in her eaves. And on the same subject, she did make a couple of other works. There are 3 paintings that are all very sort of red and yellow palette, called The Modern Muse, Madonna with a Cat's Cradle, and Unnatural Child. And they all feel kind of, she's exploring ideas around maternity and sort of maternal instincts and what femininity is, if femininity is a construct. And they will all be in the Whitechapel show. I can't remember if we put any of those. We don't think we did in the book, did we, Harriet?
Other than, I think, autobiography of the embryo. Yeah. Let me move on. There's another question from Hannah that says that Agar's collages remind me of those of Dorothea Tanning. Do you know if the two ever met? And was there much of a female subgroup of surrealists?
I don't think that she met Dorothea Tanning. Actually, maybe I'm wrong. She might have met her. Peggy Guggenheim had a big exhibition of surrealists after the war, and they were both included in that. So maybe she did meet her then. I don't think they were close. I think that the war really meant that sort of European surrealists or international surrealists and British surrealists became really divided. So I know that she was close to Eiffel Colquhoun and very close to Lee Miller and Valentine Penrose and Dora Maar and Noosh Eloir. And they all supported one another's practice. But I think the more international surrealists like Dorothea Tanning and Leonora Carrington and Merritt Oppenheim, I think the war just meant that they weren't able to generate their ideas and their work together.
Okay, thank you. And then I think there's 2 more questions that I can see, so I'm going to try and get through those quickly. Sarah says, can you say a bit more about her use of rocks? She's looking at Cézanne's rock paintings and trying to understand his rocks as nature or as fantasy. And she says it's interesting that Agar seems to be exploring the same aspects but coming to a different answer in her rock art.
I think that for her, the rocks, and the same with like a shell or a fossil, she found them to be representative of this idea that, like I said, she thought that nature was the most impressive surrealist, that no human surrealist would ever be able to do better than nature and the formations of nature. And so I think it's more a kind of act of admiration to photograph them and then paint them later. And the same, I think, like with the way she employs shells and fossils and leaves and birds, and I think she's just sort of celebrating the natural world rather than trying to harness it. She's sort of celebrating it.
Okay, and I'm going to make this the last question because it's now 5 to 8. So Kitty says, she asked, did you mention that she also did some design work?
Yeah, hi Kitty, I know Kitty. She did some graphic design for her. She often did her own exhibition design posters and flyers, and we've used. There's one really beautiful one where she pours her name in enamel paint, which we've then sort of taken and used on the exhibition catalogue, and will be the sort of graphic for the exhibition entrance. And she did some hat design as well. As I said, this hat that she called the ceremonial hat for eating bouillabaisse, which is made out of lobsters and shells, and another hat made out of thousands of pairs of gloves layered on top of each other called glove hat. So yeah, a bit of fashion design and a bit of graphic design.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to end the evening there because it's very late. Lauren has been signing for almost an hour now. So thank you very much, Laura, for that fascinating talk. Thank you to Five Leaves for hosting us. And I think this has been recorded this evening and it will be available to watch again on the Five Leaves YouTube channel soon. And thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. Thank you so much. Bye.